Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to week 6 of the UBI Field Experiments Master's class, and we now have 2 more student discussions of the special issue and ethical perspectives on UBI Field Experiments. The next one is coming from UBI Patel, if I'm saying that right. Please correct my pronunciation.
No, it's right. Yeah.
All right, there you go.
Yeah. So I read the article, Do We Need Basic Income Experiments by Malcolm Torrey. In this article, various pilot projects and experiments are discussed, and the difference between basic income and basic income scheme, as well as pilot projects and experiments, are clarified in this article. So there's this question I had while considering experiments: is basic income still universal even if it is temporary? I mean, is it still considered universal in terms of time? Wouldn't basic income experiments have to be conducted in a more or less environment where situations like pandemic have not taken place? These are the 2 first questions I have, and one more I'll ask, but could you just answer these first?
Sure. Sweet. Can I just ask you to, thank you so much for your questions. Can I just ask you to repeat the second? So the first, I guess you said, is it universal? Should it be conducted on a long-term basis? Was that the first one?
Yeah. And the first one also meant, when we are considering an experiment, is it still universal in terms of time? Because it will be conducted only for a short span.
Okay. Those are great questions. So I think one of the, just providing an intro and then replying fast. So I think one of the benefits of Malcolm Torrey's paper, there are a lot of benefits, but the one that I thought was very beneficial was to try to engage on a discussion of whether the experiments that are taking place can all be branded as unconditional basic income experiments or pilots, or whether we should have a broader category of, for example, unconditional cash grant experiments, and then discuss in more finer grain whether one is a guaranteed income experiment, another one is a UBI pilot. So try to understand whether it's good to have everything in the same bucket, or whether we should have several small buckets where we compare amongst them, but do not necessarily compare them all. And we can go into that discussion, both you and me, Jui, but also everyone else, if you would like, because I think that's an important discussion for how we assess and look at the results. About your questions, so considering the entire bucket, so not making making a distinction between the different type of experiments that we have. So most experiments are very different from what a UBI, unconditional basic income, is in its purest, more theoretical definition. And of course, one of the problems is the fact that they are short term, as you were rightly pointing out. But that's not necessarily a problem in terms of the definition, I would say. So a definition of, I prefer conditional basic income says that you already probably know this quite well, is that it's a cash grant, that it's individual, granted to a person instead of a household. It's given to everyone in the same political community, no strings attached money, basic income in the sense of allowing someone to live a life with dignity, or at least some sort of close to the living wage. So the problem of being a short term, I don't think, my personal opinion, that makes it, if it's short term, it doesn't make it be less or more universal. The problem with short term is the type of results that you're able to get out of the experiment. So for example, when you are the guaranteed income experiment, so when you have an experiment that you're targeting, because some are targeted, a small group of people, and you are providing unconditional cash. If you do it for 1 year, you might see some results in terms of material deprivation, in terms of increases in welfare. If you do it for 5 years, people can make decisions in their lives a little bit different. Maybe they can quit their own job because they know they have 5 years to find a new one. Maybe they could go to college. So there's the time horizon is important, not necessarily because it makes it more or less universal, but because it allows us to have more data and more robust data about the impacts of unconditional cash. About being universal or not, so most experiments are not universal, either because they are guaranteed ones, so they target particular groups in society to give them unconditional cash, and this happens for a whole bunch of reasons, either scientific reasons, because people want to understand the impact of unconditional cash in certain minorities or in certain groups that are more vulnerable, or because of political reasons, which already happen, in the sense that it's easier to sell sometimes. It's easier to sell an experiment that it's targeted at the poor than maybe to sell an experiment, that it's targeted at people with more money. It might be more difficult politically to sell it. So in one way, a lot of the experiments are targeted to particular groups, so they are not universal in any sense of the word. There's also the fact that experiments, if they use what I think you probably already know what it is, the randomized control trial methodology, right? Where you have a treatment and a control group. Obviously, you need to have one segment of the population, and usually control groups need to be larger than treatment groups, that is not receiving unconditional cash. So automatically, you also don't have a universal experiment. There has been some pilots where either your control group was in another similar village, or you use saturation studies, which I also think you probably already know what it is, where you can have more of a sort of sense of universality of the policy. But I don't think that has been the norm in most experiments that have taken place. I hope I've answered you, but you can add and ask more things.
No, it's clear. And the second question that I had was, wouldn't basic income experiments have to be conducted in a more or less environment where situations like this pandemic have not taken place? So if we conduct experiments in situations like pandemic, the results might differ, and the outcome in general can differ to what the actual outcome would be if the situations were different.
That's an excellent, thank you so much for raising that point, Rui. That's an excellent point. That's the idea of whether an experiment, of what is the impact of shocks when you have an experiment. And COVID-19 is a shock, right? And that has happened in some of the experiments that were taking place. And it's a shock not only because of what the way COVID impacted people, either they were unemployed, either they had family members who died. I've heard horrible stories of people who were living very well, and so the unconditional cash that they were receiving was going to make a huge leverage in their lives, but then they got COVID, their family members got COVID, they got medical bills piling up, and so now they are living below the poverty line, and the unconditional cash became just a lifeline to survive instead of leveraging them towards whatever goals they had for their lives in the medium to long term. So shocks are very important, but they are also important because of the policies that can take place afterwards. So for example, in a lot of countries, there were unconditional cash grants granted one time or two times to people, which means that if you had an experiment, all of a sudden you had the unconditional cash being granted, but also all sorts of other social assistance mechanisms that were coming in, which can influence the overall impact that you have. That being said, I think shocks, of course, they do impact what you're going to be able to see, but that happens every time you have an experiment. When you have an experimental setting that is taking place in real life, so you don't have a micro simulation setting where you control all the variables, shocks are going to take place. Either a government's going to increase, that would be good, or decrease the minimum wage, or you can have micro shocks in a particular neighborhood. Some sort of traumatic event takes place and community members help themselves out, and that changes the community outcomes or the community effects within the neighborhood. So shocks, it's something that are a part of what an experiment is. So I don't think there are experiments in a vacuum if they are taking place with real people, so you cannot avoid shocks. So I don't think experiments should happen. I don't think it's possible on the one hand, except if you have microsimulation studies, which I think are limited if you only have them. And so it's not possible to avoid shocks. What you need to do, I think, is engage with the people who are receiving the money or who are in the control group, depending on the method, and look to have all sorts of methods in your research to be able to understand what is the impact of the money that was granted, what is the impact of the shock that took place, and what were the shocks, COVID, but others, and understand the influence of them, of the two things. So maybe, for example, the fact that governments granted unconditional cash during the pandemic improved people's overall perception of unconditional cash and was actually positive for some of the experiments taking place that use unconditional cash. So actually the influence might have been interesting and important for how you're going to understand the assessment and the results of an unconditional cash grant. So long story short, I don't think there are vacuum experiments. I don't think that would even be good. You just have to have mixed methods, triangulate data to understand the impact of everything that is going on around your experimentation setting. But that was a great question. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. And the last thing that I had, but I am not sure I understand the microsimulation part much, but so I might be wrong here. So do correct me if I'm wrong. So here researchers can use microsimulation to get a clear understanding of the overall effects on income distribution at the national level. However, one key flaw or defect in this form of study is that it assumes no changes in behavior, that is example, labor market response and stuff. So as it is mentioned in the article, that microanalysis assumes all the static effects, and its only disadvantage is not having dynamic implications. That is, it doesn't consider long-term changing effects. So my question is there any way or type of analysis which considers these dynamic effects, which will cover the disadvantages of microsimulations? So this will not only eliminate the shortcomings of microsimulations, but will also be helpful for factors considering on the ground pilot projects with high accuracy.
A great question. Thank you, Julie. So I'm not an economist, so I want to make sure that if I say something that is not entirely accurate, Carl corrects me because he knows this much more than me. So please feel free to add and correct. I think
the answer. Have a room full of economists here, so I'm not the only one that can correct you.
Ooh, that's okay. That's intimidating. So feel free, everyone, to add if you want. I was going to say that I think Carl's book provides the necessary answer for your question, Julie, but I'm going to try to emulate tell you a little bit what was my impression of what Carl says in the book, and that's why I was saying Carl can add if you want. So I haven't seen a lot of microsimulation studies. I know one that is very interesting that Carl and George Arndt wrote about the potential cost of unconditional basic income in the UK, which was interesting because it allowed you to have a very well-tied analysis of the cost and the post-cost of an unconditional basic income in a way that experiments haven't been able to tell us or provide a lot of data on. And I think microsimulation for some particular aspects, the cost, maybe some impacts in labor supply can be interesting. But my reading of Carl's book and going directly into your question is that we shouldn't use only microsimulation exactly because of what Malcolm Torrey tells us and what you were talking about, the fact that you're going to have very static results, because microsimulation in essence is you who are going to input data on to try to observe results that take place. So you input variables and data on into the simulation to see what the results are. But what I think Carl is arguing in the book is to try to combine microsimulation with data and information that we have from experimental settings about how people behave towards the labor market or behave towards their communities or maybe their consumption patterns. So in a way, it's try to, we know we have this rich set of data from experiments that is limited because it's either short-term or because it's in a particular place or because it was a saturation study and we don't have a control, or it wasn't a saturation study, so we don't have many community effects, but we do have this rich set of data that can help us compute variables into the microsimulation to add a little bit on behavioral aspects that might be limited if we only do microsimulation. So that was my reading of what Carl was mentioning in the book. Carl, feel free to add if you want, and it'll be a way to counter a little bit of the limitations that Malcolm Torrey talks about when he is arguing for basic income pilots against microsimulation.
Yeah, so this is all that I had. Thank you so much.
So let me open up. Thank you, Jui. Let me then open up to the class to respond what you two, Maria.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Andrea. Hi.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Okay. So I just wanted to say, because Catarina said something about that now with this Corona thing and everything, people start getting to know this kind of the UBI and all of that. But I also think we also realize how much more planning this needs, because there were a lot of problems still with the with, like, not a lot of people were getting it, even though they needed it. Somehow the system still has to fix some of the things, because it wasn't like a universal basic income. It wasn't universal. It was still like, oh, you lost your job, oh, you got COVID, oh, you did this. So a lot of people who actually needed it, they were not able to apply for it because they weren't suffering enough, so to say so. So I think it was very good that people got to see that we actually need this kind of support, but it's also that maybe the approach that we're trying to give it is not yet well planned, like, yeah.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, Andrea. I think there are two sides to your very rightful comment. So the first is a lot of the unconditional, so not unconditional, but a lot of the money that was wired into people during COVID was not, it was targeted money. As you were saying, it was not universal. It was given to people that were below a certain income threshold, or that were precarious workers, depending on the context, or people who had kids. So it wasn't a universal cash grant. So in a way, it suffered from what happens administratively with many other cash grants, which are not universal, where either people need to disclose their own situation, either that they are poor, either that they have a big family, either that they have a certain occupation. And we already know that those sorts of cash grants suffer from a whole range of problems, from stigmatization, especially if they have associated conditional mechanisms, but also they suffer from the fact that people need to disclose their information. They feel stigmatized if they need to, especially if it's targeted at the poor, and also administrative hazards and a whole bunch of bureaucratic mechanisms that might not be very effective, especially in the case of COVID. Everything was very fast, money needed to be wired fast, but then there was a lot of bureaucracy because we needed to make sure that only the people who need it, or only the people who are eligible, were receiving it. But I would say, Andrea, that actually improves our argument in favor of a universal unconditional basic income. It tells us that, and I think that happened a little bit with COVID, it tells us that when shocks happen, when emergencies happen, if we already had a conditional basic income, it would be much easier. People already had the safety net or the help, even if we had to increase it or give more money to people that were struggling, we already had the infrastructure and we already had the safety net for everyone to enjoy a little bit of security, instead of needing to come up with a new mechanism full of bureaucracy that people needed to apply. So I actually think that that first part strengthens our argument in favor of an unconditional basic income. And I think that happened a little bit, at least in the UBI activist and movement. I'm not sure if in the political side, maybe a little bit, but I'm not sure if it has proven to be as effective as we would like. But the second aspect is, so One is that we had targeted mechanisms that suffer from the same problems, bureaucratic hazards that other conditional targeted cash grants have. But the second one is that we cannot be too naive when we think about that a universal or unconditional basic income is going to be very fast and very effective in wiring money to people. And I'm saying this, try to explain, because I remember having a conversation with the people who are engaged in researching the Maricá in Brazil, close to Rio de Janeiro, not experiment, policy, which is a local currency kind of basic income, still targeted, but it's being increased towards encompassing more people in the Maricá region. And I remember that the researcher was telling me that finding a way to be very effective in wiring money to everyone, especially in a place like Brazil, especially in a small town like Maricá, was much tougher than what everyone thought. You need to have an infrastructure in place where you know everyone in the city, where you know all their bank accounts, and where you very easily are able to wire money for them. It's true that in some Western contexts, this is easier because of tax systems, and you already have sort of the infrastructure to be able to reach a lot of people, but you might still have a percentage of the population that perhaps needs a UBI the most, or at least needs it a lot, that it's off the grid or it's not necessarily accessible. So you need, even with an unconditional basic income, you need to build an infrastructure, and you might have some growing pains in the beginning or a learning curve to have the infrastructure necessary to make it very easy when you need to wire money for everyone. Of course, again, the problem that happened with COVID reinforces our argument, because if you build the infrastructure now, because you want to have an unconditional basic income, even if a very low one to start off, when a shock happens, you can very quickly, if the infrastructure is in place, increase the money that you are wiring to make sure that everyone is set and has a safety net, instead of needing to build everything out of desperation and out of sensing that people need help. So I hope this answers your question, Andrea.
Yeah, I'd like to say something that's too. In the US, the COVID payments were very broad, including rich, poor, middle class, but they were targeted in such a way that they left off the people who needed it most, because it was for everyone who paid taxes in the previous year. So if you were too poor to have filed taxes the previous year, which was most of the homeless population, you were not eligible. So they did it just in such a way to exclude the people who would most need it, rather than exclude, people who are higher up. That's a sad thing about a lot of targeting, actually excludes some of the most needy. Okay, should we move on to Niharika?
Hello. So I did an article by Dr. Sanding. It's called Basic Income Pilots. It uses limitations and design principles. And the main goal of this article was, it says that pilots are not to be taken as final justification for whether to move towards a UBI system or not, but they could still be pretty useful. For instance, they can tell us about the non-monetary benefits of basic income, or like how a basic income could be implemented, etc. And then I think it's a pretty straightforward article. Like, the author differentiates between pilots and experiments, and he talks about pilots that were already conducted and those that are ongoing. And then he talks about what would be the requirements for a pilot of basic income to be a true pilot. That is, it should be basic, in cash, universal, not lump sum, no selectivity, and like no changes in other policies to assess the effects of UBI only. And there were much more requirements that he talked about. Then he talked about how the pilot could be designed and its evaluation and monitoring. And so my question is to you, like in general, with respect to the last paragraph of the article, that says that the pilots and experiments can be useful to identify other institutional changes or policy changes that could be made to ease out the introduction of UBI. So like, I just want to ask if you have like ever been able to identify any such institutional changes or policy changes with respect to any particular country, or like in general.
Ooh, interesting, tough question. So I'm going to give you what my very personal opinion is. Of course, that's what you are expecting, but please take it with a grain of salt. Also from someone who is very early in the UBI movement and is still learning a lot. So take it with a grain of salt. So I think I don't agree with a lot of the narratives that tell us that basic income experiments will be very helpful in itself for political implementation of a UBI, in the sense that they will allow us to understand policy change. They will allow us to they will allow us to have policy changes towards an unconditional basic income. I think they can be, because I believe that with almost all policies, for me, that would come from political activism. That will come from bottom-up movements arguing for, I think for most policies, at least the ones who are progressive. It will come from big, strong coalitions, movements that are looking and who are fighting to have policy changes, namely seeing unconditional cash implemented. I think experiments can help fueling the movements in a lot of ways, because they can spark the discussion. Because if you have a lot of experiments going on, maybe more people will engage with the idea of unconditional cash and will become activists, which can fuel the movement towards seeing people arguing it and demanding that their representatives support an unconditional basic income or a guaranteed income or whatever we might be fighting about depending on the setting that we are. So regarding that last paragraph, I'm not sure if it can help legitimize basic income. I'm skeptical about that. Yeah, so that's one thing. I think it's a little bit obscure looking at how experiments can help us identify policies or institutional change that can make its introduction easier and more effective. I think that they can provide clues about which sort of things you need to do if you want to implement a UBI and minimize some of its negative impacts. I'm going to give an example. You probably already heard about, or maybe if you haven't, I think it's a cool article to read. You heard about David Kalnitsky article where he talks about the negative income tax experiment that took place in Canada around the same time that they were taking place in the US. And he argues that the framing of the experiment, the ideological framing of the experiment, and how that was also weaved with the ideological framing of the participants, reduced how they felt vis-a-vis the negative income tax that they were receiving. It means that because the experiment was framed as a research effort, something where everyone was asked to join to try to understand how a potential negative income tax could impact the community, people did not feel stigmatized like they used to when they received social assistance mechanisms. They didn't felt the poor, they didn't felt they were different from other people who worked and were able to make ends meet with the wage they were earning. They felt that they were relevant, that they were providing important feedback, that they were doing something for the community. I think Kalnitsky's insight and what he got from the experiment is important if we wish to implement an unconditional basic income that is not necessarily stigmatizing for some people. Of course, an unconditional basic income, if implemented as a policy, will have less stigmatizing potential impacts because it's granted to everyone in an unconditional manner, so on and so forth. But this is an important insight to understand how the framing of the policy will be important for stigmatization. Another aspect, in the basic income, guaranteed income policy in Barcelona, the beam income, I think this is the right name, echoing the Canada experiment, they looked at how several treatments could impact people that are excluded and who are low income in a particular neighborhood in Barcelona. And so they had one treatment group receiving unconditional cash, but then they had one treatment group that was receiving money, but also was encouraged to attend volunteer sessions, one who was receiving money, but encouraged to attend coaching sessions or entrepreneurial sessions. So they had a whole bunch of treatment groups to compare how unconditional cash works, how having volunteer work, being able to do volunteer works or having a support group works. So to try to assess how everything impacted people's well-being, their sense of being included in the neighborhood where they were living, so on and so forth. And they found actually that people in some of these groups where they were encouraged to join support groups or doing volunteer felt more included in the neighborhoods where they were and in the society where they were in Barcelona than people who were only receiving unconditional cash. And as I think they rightly point out, this is not surprising. Their main target group was people who felt excluded, who were from vulnerable populations, some were immigrants. So it's normal that maybe they didn't have very strong social groups, or maybe they had it, but they were very small, very limited. So when you open up the possibility of not only having material needs because they receive money, but also access, if you wanted to support groups or to volunteer association in a certain associations, your scope of social interaction is going to increase. So it's normal that you feel more included and maybe you feel better and happier. But what this tells us is that a UBI, which it might be straightforward, but it's important to look at experiments to see it maybe confirmed or reinforced, that we cannot simply believe that, well, let's implement a UBI and go away with social assistance mechanism, with social services. We don't need them. We only need to give money to people. No, it means that maybe we need to have a UBI, but we need to have other sorts of mechanisms that I would argue should be free. People should be free to join them, of course, especially and not tied to the money that they are receiving, but that allow people to have social support groups, social services that can help them, volunteer in training and skilling opportunities. So this all to say that I think it's not necessarily that it might make a political implementation easier, but I think most importantly, it might make it better depending on what is the goals that we have when we think about implementing a conditional basic income. If it's improving the overall population well-being in the sense of feeling freer, happier, healthier, more included, then in that case, looking at these sorts of insights of experiments can be very, very important. Thank you, Nyarika. I don't know if you have other questions or if you disagree.
No, thank you. That was really interesting, like with a different perspective. But yeah, that was my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Does anyone in the room want to, does anyone in the room have any other questions?
Hello, Catarina. My question was about the ethical dilemma of conducting an experiment in underdeveloped nations when there is no guarantee that it will be completely protected from any political transformation, or even besides that, like I read a paper on the post-Namibian experiment where they try to extend the allowance. They tried to like have a bridge allowance. They ended the experiment on 2009, and then they had a bridge allowance till, I guess, till 2012, as long as they had money, and they were just waiting for the implementation because UBI experiment was quite successful. So that poses an ethical dilemma for people who are happy with the experiment, but now they, you know, if something went wrong, or if that project had to be canceled before time, then, you know, what does that mean for the people who are part of the experiment?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And if you remember in the special issue, Josette tried to engage with, she tried to formulate an equation where we could, or a potential framework to be able to assess whether the ethical problems of engaging in experimentation can be offset with the potential benefits that we have. She talked about cost benefits, but in essence, I think that's part of what she's saying. I'm not sure how to answer you. I'm very troubled with the ethical dilemmas of experiments, and not only in the global South. I think it's most experiments, even in Western context, the ones that are taking place in the US, but also a lot of the ones who took place in Barcelona, the Finnish basic income experiment, who took place with long-term unemployed people, they take place with people who are vulnerable. They are vulnerable either because they are from particular minorities, they are young moms, or they are low-income populations. They take place with people who are long-term unemployed and probably already traumatized with what social assistance has done to them for quite some time. And then you have all of the experiments taking place in the global South, where there's actually 0 to none welfare mechanisms, the ones that are available for people. Maybe there are community, certainly there are community nonprofits and community-based organizations and people who are helping them, who are helping themselves, but it's very complicated. And I think you pointed out to the aspect of a dilemma that comes when and we know this, like Bru also argued, we know that most experiments haven't led to political implementation. So we know that it's a long shot when we are doing an experiment that something's going to happen in the next couple of years or maybe decades towards implementing a UBI. So you have that dilemma, which is, you're giving money to people, and most likely not only the experiment is not going to be extended, but also a UBI is not going to be introduced in the next couple of years. And this is fact. Of course, it can change in the future, but that's what happens so far. But you also have what for me sometimes is the most horrible dilemma, which is most experiments are the randomized control trials. So you know that you are granting money to some people, whereas others are going to receive 0 of the money that you have for the experiment. And not only you know that, but you are also going to engage with them for research purposes. So you're going to go into their homes, or you're going to talk with them in a particular place, and you're going to ask them about their maybe difficult life, their challenges, perhaps all the financial difficulties that they are having, and all the other, maybe you're going to talk also about good things, the good things that they have in their lives. Obviously, I'm more pessimistic than optimistic, so I'm going to give you the bad side of it. But you're going to engage with a lot of the difficulties that they have. And at the end of the interview, you're going to say, this was great. Thank you so much. You helped me know a lot about unconditional cash, but I cannot tell you that this is going to be implemented. I hope it will. I hope your testimony was important for people to understand how someone in poverty, someone who's struggling, or someone who just had a difficult life could be helped with a little bit of money. But yeah, I cannot tell you that this is going to be implemented. So for me, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write about experiments, because they provide us a lot of insights, and it's so interesting to talk about them from a research standpoint. And it's incredible to be able to go and talk to people about how unconditional cash is important, how their perceptions of deservingness changes because of receiving unconditional cash. But then the other side of it is understanding, and this is true for every social experiment, is that you're engaging with people who are getting a sense of what it would be so good to have money, extra money, but I guess this is not going to happen. So yeah, I think I can tell you a more optimistic so this to say, I don't know how to solve it. I don't know how I think you can justify it in the sense of believing that it seems this is fueling the debate, and we are getting every little step closer towards having more national and robust debates on UBI, but it still seems to be something that is not going to happen next year, I think. One. Second, I think a more optimistic person could tell you, well, it's still horrible that we are, not horrible, it's still difficult that we are doing this, but at least maybe you gave money to someone who needed it for 1 year or for 2 years or for 3 years. And the poor are people with autonomy and agency. They are smart, they are savvy, they are just like everyone else. They are people like us, maybe, who are just struggling a little bit. And so they use the money well, and they are able to, a lot of the times, leverage it in a way that is important for them and for their families. So they will make the most out of the money that they receive. So in a way, you can frame it as, it is an experiment. It's getting us closer to a little bit of having a UBI, and it's also providing money for those who need it, even if for a short period of time. There are worse things that we could do than doing that. This is what an optimistic person would tell you. Some days this is not what I feel, but we can try to justify like that. I'm sorry for being a very convoluted answer, but yeah, that's
No,
yeah.
thank you so much for your input. I also like struggle with the same debate. Like, are we? It feels like when we're comparing, when we're contributing or providing the UBI to the controlled group, sorry, the selected group, and then the control group stays put. It's like we are the ones to decide what will happen to the future. So it feels very it's almost saddening, but I guess this is the thing with social science experiments. Thank you so much for your input.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a problem with social sciences experiments. So yeah, I think we need to grant more autonomy. We need to not only believe we have data that people who are receiving money, they do have autonomy, agency, so they make the most out of it. And yeah, we need to focus a little bit on that to be able to feel less bad about ourselves when we are conducting them.
Yeah, I will contribute a little something there too. Remember, for those of you who were there on Tuesday when we had the online workshop, we had Paul Niehaus from Give Directly, who has to keep. They have an experimental group that's getting one-time grants, another experimental group that's getting short-term 2-year regular grants every month for 2 years, and then another experimental group is getting a long-term grant for every month for 12 years, which means they've got to keep a control group enthusiastic about letting them share their data for 12 years while all these other people are getting stuff and they're not getting it. That's tough, but that's what you have to do to study it. All right, do we have any more questions? Oh, and Catarina, did it come up last time? Did you say that you've not yet completed your PhD?
Not yet. I'm trying to complete it until March 2023, before I turn 30. That's my personal goal.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, so Catarina is really, then you got to remember, is really only a few years ahead of you in graduate school. She's a graduate student like you, and look, you know, she's just a few years ahead of you, and look all she's done. She's a special editor of a journal issue. She's published in journals and stuff like that, writing a large work, which will be her dissertation, working with, you know, top scholars like Roberto Mero and Gail Standing. So this is, you know, if this is right for you to keep going, you know, after your master's, this is what, you know, this is what you can do too. All right. So thank you so much, Catarina, for joining us. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone. Good luck for your masters and for your future projects.